Imagine discovering that your country has been at war for 335 years, and then discovering nobody remembered to actually fight it. No armies marching, no cannons firing, no heroic final battle. Just 3 centuries of international awkwardness, followed by someone finally saying, "Hey, should we probably end that war?" This is the bizarre story of the war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly, a conflict supposedly lasting from 1651 until 1986. Yes, 1986. That means the war lasted so long that people could have been born, raised families, grown old, and died without realizing they were technically living in a war zone. But before we get into the ridiculous part, we need to go back to 17th century England, when Europe was basically running on civil wars, religious arguments, and people who apparently believed every disagreement required a fleet. It is the year 1651. England is in the middle of the English Civil War. King Charles I has been executed, Parliament has won, and Oliver Cromwell is now running the country. But not everyone is impressed with the new government. One of the biggest remaining groups resisting Parliament is the Royalist Navy. And where does this navy go when things start getting uncomfortable? The Isles of Scilly. These islands sit off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean. Today they are known for beaches, wildlife, and beautiful scenery. Back then, they were basically a convenient parking lot for a fleet that had just lost most of England.
So,
the Royalists controlled the islands and continued fighting Parliament from there. Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic had its own problems. The Dutch were fighting a war against Spain, and they had become a major naval and trading power. Their ships were everywhere. And when English Royalists began attacking Dutch merchant vessels, the Dutch decided that enough was enough. So they sent a fleet toward the Isles of Scilly. The Dutch commander, Lieutenant Admiral Martin Tromp, was not exactly arriving with a basket of peace cookies. His job was to demand compensation for losses suffered by Dutch shipping. The Royalists refused. The Dutch fleet then blockaded the islands. And this is where history takes a wonderfully stupid turn. According to the traditional story, the Dutch formally declared war on the Isles of Scilly. The Royalists eventually surrendered to Parliament. The Dutch went home. And somehow, nobody signed a peace treaty. Think about that for a second. The people who started the war left. The people being fought surrendered to someone else. And the supposed war just sat there in the background like an unfinished email. The Netherlands moved on. England moved on. The Isles of Scilly moved on. Europe moved on. Humanity invented steam engines, railways, electricity, telephones, airplanes, tanks, computers. And this war was apparently still open. For 335 years. Now there is an important catch. Historians debate whether this was ever legally a real war in the first place. The evidence for an actual formal declaration is surprisingly weak. Some historians argue that the famous story was exaggerated or misunderstood. The Dutch may have been involved in military action around Scilly, but that does not necessarily mean they formally declared war on the islands themselves. Still, the legend became famous because it has one irresistible feature. Nobody bothered to end it. And that is where the story gets even funnier. Imagine being a Dutch government official in 1700. Sir, we have an urgent national security issue. What is it? We are still technically at war with the Isles of Scilly. Are they attacking us? No. Are we attacking them? No. Then what exactly is the problem? Well, technically, that conversation could have happened for generations. The 18th century came and went. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain. Steam engines appeared. Factories exploded across Europe. Railways connected cities. The world became dramatically more modern. And somewhere in the legal attic of history, the Netherlands and Scilly were still apparently glaring at each other from across the English Channel. Then came the 19th century. The British Empire expanded enormously. The Netherlands became a modern constitutional monarchy. Millions of people were born who had absolutely no idea that their country was supposedly still at war with a handful of islands. Imagine going to school and learning world history. Napoleon invaded Europe. The French Revolution happened. The American Civil War happened. World War I happened. World War II happened. And then your teacher says, oh, and technically the Netherlands has also been at war with some islands since 1651. The student raises a hand. Did they fight? No. Did anyone die? Not in this war. Then why are we learning it? Because history has a sense of humor. By the 20th century, the story had become an odd historical curiosity. But the war still had not been officially ended. And then finally, somebody decided to do something about it. The person who helped bring the story back to life was Roy Duncan, a historian and chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council. Duncan became interested in the old story of the Dutch War. He contacted Dutch representatives and began discussing the possibility of finally signing a peace treaty. Because apparently, after 335 years, everyone finally remembered they had unfinished paperwork. In 1985, Dutch ambassador Rein Heidekoper visited the Isles of Scilly. The whole thing sounds like the setup for a comedy. A Dutch diplomat arrives on tiny British islands to discuss a war that began before his country had finished becoming the modern country we know today. There were no soldiers lined up, no artillery, no battlefield, just diplomats, historians, and paperwork. And on April 17, 1986, a peace treaty was signed. After 335 years, the war was over. And the most impressive part, there had been no fighting, no casualties, no destroyed cities, no famous battlefield, no dramatic final charge. Just peace. The treaty was signed at Hugh Town on St. Mary's, the largest of the Isles of Scilly. The Dutch ambassador and the island authorities finally closed the book on one of history's strangest supposed conflicts. And suddenly, the world's longest war had ended without anyone needing to fire a single shot. Honestly, this may be the greatest example of procrastination in international relations. Imagine waiting 335 years to do something that could have been completed in 5 minutes. Why did the war last so long? Administrative reasons. Now, if you are wondering how a war could last 335 years without a battle, the answer is simple. A war does not automatically continue because people are constantly fighting. In historical and legal terms, a conflict can theoretically remain unresolved if no formal peace settlement is made. But in this particular case, we should be careful with the famous claim. The idea that the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly were officially at war for the entire 335 years is more legend than straightforward historical fact. There is no strong evidence that Dutch officials spent 3 centuries planning an invasion of Scilly. Nobody in Amsterdam was waking up every morning saying, "All right, boys, today is the day we finally conquer those islands." And nobody on Scilly was looking out toward the sea every afternoon thinking, "Those Dutch are definitely coming." The islands had much bigger things to worry about. Weather, fishing, trade, politics, and eventually tourists. Still, the story remains fascinating because it shows how strange history can become when bureaucracy, memory, and politics collide. The original conflict itself came from a very real and very violent period. The English Civil War was not a joke. Thousands of people died. England was divided between supporters of Parliament and supporters of the monarchy. The Royalists used the Isles of Scilly as a base because of their strategic location. The Dutch had powerful commercial interests to protect. So when Dutch ships were attacked, the Netherlands had a legitimate reason to intervene. This was not simply two countries flipping coins to decide who could call themselves enemies. There were real ships, real political tensions, and real economic losses involved. But after the Royalists surrendered, the entire situation changed. The Dutch no longer had a reason to remain. So they left, and the paperwork apparently stayed behind. For centuries. That is what makes the story so entertaining. Modern wars usually have treaties. World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles. World War II ended with formal surrenders and agreements. Other conflicts end with negotiations, borders, prisoners exchanged, and politicians standing behind microphones saying extremely serious things. The Scilly War ended because someone finally thought, wait, are we still technically doing this? It is almost like leaving a group chat and forgetting to remove yourself from the family subscription. Except the subscription lasted 335 years. There is another funny detail. The Isles of Scilly are tiny. They are an archipelago of more than 100 islands and rocks, although only a few are inhabited. The population is small compared with the nations usually associated with legendary wars. So imagine comparing this supposed conflict with wars involving millions of soldiers. One side had the Dutch Republic. The other side had some islands off Cornwall. And somehow, according to the famous story, they became partners in the longest war in history. It sounds like a video game matchup somebody created after running out of ideas. Netherlands versus Scilly. Difficulty level, apparently nobody shows up. The strangest thing is that the war did not become famous because of what happened during it. It became famous because nothing happened. That is the entire punchline. A war lasting centuries normally sounds terrifying. You expect generations of soldiers. You expect battlefields covered in ruins. You expect maps changing every few years. Instead, this one produced almost none of that. The clock kept ticking. And finally, done. The funniest part is that the people signing the peace treaty were not descendants of generals meeting after a long struggle. They were basically historians and diplomats cleaning up an ancient historical loose end. It was less peace after centuries of bloodshed, and more, we should probably close that tab. And there is something surprisingly beautiful about that. Because the story reminds us that history is not always made of giant battles and famous kings. Sometimes history is made by forgotten paperwork. Sometimes an event survives because somebody tells a funny story about it. And sometimes the world's longest war turns out to be a war in which nobody actually remembers fighting. The Isles of Scilly eventually became known for tourism and natural beauty rather than military conflict. The Netherlands continued being the Netherlands. The two sides had no massive reconciliation ceremony. No one demanded territory. No one demanded compensation. No one stood up and shouted, "After 335 years, victory is ours." Because there was nothing to win. The war was finally over simply because everybody agreed it should be over. And that might be the most peaceful ending imaginable. So, what can we learn from the 335-year war? First, always finish your paperwork. Second, if you start a war, remember to end it. And third, if you are ever in a disagreement with someone and think it has lasted a long time, remember that somewhere in history, two sides apparently spent 335 years forgetting to sign a piece of paper. At least your argument is probably not going to last 3 centuries. Probably. The story of the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly is often introduced as the longest war in history. But the real historical lesson is a little more complicated. It was not 335 years of continuous combat. It was not even necessarily a formally recognized war for all those centuries. The famous claim survives because the original conflict supposedly ended without a peace treaty, leaving a humorous legal loose end that was finally addressed in 1986. So when someone tells you that the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly were at war for 335 years, the best response is not simply, "Well, that's crazy." It is, apparently, but let's check the fine print. Because history has fine print. Lots of it. And sometimes the fine print is more entertaining than the war itself. For 335 years, the supposed enemies did not destroy each other's cities. They did not send armies across Europe. They did not fight some enormous final battle. They simply carried on with their lives while an ancient conflict sat quietly in the background. Then one day, a historian looked at the old story and basically said, "Should we finish this?" And the Netherlands said yes. So in 1986, after centuries of waiting, the longest war in history finally ended. Not with a cannon, not with a sword, not with a dramatic battlefield victory, but with a signature. And honestly, after 335 years, that might have been the most efficient attack of the entire conflict. One pen, one piece of paper. War over. Imagine explaining that to a soldier from 1651. Don't worry, eventually we'll win. How? Paperwork. Excellent. And that is how one of history's strangest wars became a legend. A war that lasted 335 years. Without a single shot being fired. Because sometimes history does not need explosions to be unbelievable. Sometimes all it needs is two people forgetting to sign the peace treaty. And here is where the story becomes even more ridiculous when you compare it with ordinary human behavior. If two countries supposedly remain at war, you would expect at least one person to notice. But apparently international diplomacy has a powerful feature called, "we'll deal with it later." And later became 1700. Then later became 1800. Then later became 1900. At that point, later had grandchildren. The people who created the problem were long gone. Entire governments disappeared and were replaced. The world map changed. Empires rose and collapsed. Yet this unfinished diplomatic issue somehow survived like the world's most stubborn notification. Imagine the Dutch ambassador arriving in 1986 and saying, "Good news, we finally fixed that thing from 1651. And someone on Scilly responds, "Oh, we still had that." A strange historical detail gets repeated. Eventually, the story becomes famous enough that people assume it must be perfectly documented. But history rarely works that neatly. In this case, the 335-year war is famous, but historians question exactly what was declared, who was legally involved, and whether a continuous state of war truly existed. That does not ruin the story. Honestly, it makes it better. The real story is not that two nations spent 335 years desperately trying to destroy each other. It is that a 17th century conflict created a legend so strange that centuries later, people decided to officially close the book on it. So remember the little islands off Cornwall. Remember the Dutch fleet. Remember the missing peace treaty. And most importantly, remember to read the paperwork. Because apparently forgetting one signature can keep a war alive for 3.5 centuries. That is not military strategy. That is advanced procrastination. And somehow, after all that time, nobody needed to win the war. They only needed to remember it existed. Past isn't dead. It's waiting to be told.